The bank manager slid the folder back across the desk before Daniel Voss had even finished his sentence. No raised voice, no argument, just a closed folder, and a man in a pressed shirt telling a third-generation grain farmer that the answer was no. Outside the window, 1,100 acres of Kansas wheat ground sat waiting on a decision that had nothing to do with rain and everything to do with risk. His father, Walt Voss, had died 18 months earlier, on a Tuesday in March, in the same field where he'd taught Daniel to drive a tractor at age 9. A heart attack, fast, no warning, the kind of death that leaves a farm running on momentum long after the man who built it is gone. Daniel had buried his father and then, almost without pause, inherited a fleet of equipment that was already old when Walt was still alive to nurse it through one more season. Nobody in the county had questioned whether Daniel could run the farm. They had only quietly wondered how long the equipment would let him. Daniel had expected resistance. He had not expected silence. Halverson, the loan officer who had financed his father's combine 15 years earlier, barely looked up from the numbers. 2 bad harvests. A diesel-thirsty fleet of aging equipment that cost more to keep running than it produced. A balance sheet that no longer told a story the bank wanted to be part of. The operating loan that had kept the Voss farm moving every spring for 3 generations was gone, and with it, the quiet assumption that the bank would always be there. Daniel drove home that afternoon past fields his grandfather had broken with a horse-drawn plow, past the shed where his father had taught him to set a planter by feel instead of a manual. He did not tell his wife right away. He sat in the truck in the driveway for 11 minutes, doing math that refused to balance, no matter how many times he ran it. This is the story of what happened when a man with no operating loan and no patience left for being told decided that the only way out of the hole was to sell off everything he had left and bet what remained on a single machine. By the end of that week, Daniel had made a list. Not a list of what he could afford to lose, but a list of everything he was willing to sell to stop losing. The aging case tractor his father had bought used in 2003, the second combine that had not run reliably in 2 seasons, a grain cart, a disc, a sprayer that needed a new boom, equipment that represented decades of patched-together survival, the kind of fleet that worked because a farmer like his father had known exactly which machine was good for which job and which ones to baby through one more season. His neighbor, Russ Tedder, found out from the auction listing before Daniel ever called him. Russ had farmed the section next to the Voss place for 30 years, and the 2 men had a rivalry that went back to 4-H livestock judging and had never fully cooled. When Russ pulled into the yard and saw the equipment lined up with auction tags already zip-tied to the mirrors, he didn't bother being polite about it. "You're selling the whole fleet to buy one tractor," Russ said. It wasn't a question. Daniel told him the plan: 1 machine, a Massey Ferguson 8S series, fully loaded, more horsepower and more fuel efficiency than the 3 tractors he was selling combined. 1 operator could cover what used to take 2 men and 2 machines. Fewer breakdowns, fewer repair bills bleeding him out in July when there was no time to wait on parts. Russ listened to the whole pitch and then laughed, not cruelly, but in the particular way a neighbor laughs when he thinks you've lost the thread of common sense. "You're betting the entire operation on green paint turning red," Russ said. "Everybody around here runs a mixed fleet for a reason. You put all your eggs in one basket, and that basket breaks down in June, you're not just behind. You're done." Daniel didn't argue. He had already run the numbers 100 times, late at night, after his wife and kids were asleep. The mixed fleet had been bleeding him for years. Repair bills on machines that were each 20, 30 years old. Diesel costs on equipment that drank fuel like it was still 1995. 2 operators needed during planting and harvest, when he could barely afford 1 full-time hand. The math on a single modern, high-horsepower Massey Ferguson wasn't sentimental. It was survival arithmetic, and he had decided he would rather bet everything on 1 machine he understood completely than keep nursing 4 machines that were each 1 bad season from total failure. The consignment auction was held on a gray Saturday in late February, the kind of cold that gets into a man's hands and stays there. Half the county showed up, the way they always did when a known operation liquidated equipment, because everyone wanted to see what a Voss was selling, and wonder quietly whether they were watching the slow end of a farm that had been there since before most of them were born. Daniel stood at the back of the crowd in his coat with his hands in his pockets, while the auctioneer ran through his father's old case, the disc, the grain cart, piece by piece, each item going for less than Daniel had hoped and more than he had feared. Bid by bid, the fleet his father built came apart in front of half the township. A few men nodded at him respectfully. A few didn't bother hiding their pity. Somebody behind him, a man he didn't recognize, said low enough to be plausibly deniable and loud enough to be heard, "That's a man burning his own barn down to stay warm." Daniel didn't turn around. He had already decided that the only answer to that kind of talk would come from the field, not from his mouth. His son Cole, 16 and old enough to understand exactly what was being sold and why, stood beside him through the whole auction without saying a word, and it was the boy's silence, more than the stranger's comment, that Daniel carried home with him that night. By the time the auction closed, he had just enough in the bank, combined with what little operating credit a smaller regional lender was willing to extend on the strength of his land equity, to walk into the Massey Ferguson dealership in Salina with a number that made the salesman's eyebrows lift before he tried to hide it. The dealer, a long-time equipment man named Pete Aldrich, who had sold tractors to 3 generations of farmers in that county, didn't try to talk Daniel into anything bigger. If anything, he tried to talk him into something smaller, something safer, a step down from the fully loaded 8S Daniel had his eye on. "You're putting your whole operating budget for the next 3 years into one tractor," Pete said, laying the spec sheet flat on the counter between them. "I'll sell it to you. I'm not going to pretend I won't. But you need to understand what happens to this operation if that tractor is ever down for more than a week during planting or harvest. There's no backup. There's no second machine to lean on. You're not just buying a tractor, Daniel. You're buying a single point of failure for your entire farm." Daniel had heard versions of that warning from his banker, from Russ, from his own wife at the kitchen table the night before. He pulled a folded sheet of notebook paper from his jacket pocket, numbers he'd worked out by hand over a month of nights at the kitchen table after everyone else was asleep. 4 machines, 3 of them over 20 years old, had cost him an average of $11,000 a year in repairs alone, not counting the diesel they burned doing half the work of one modern engine. One reliable tractor, even financed at a payment that scared him, still came out cheaper over 5 years than what he'd actually spent keeping his father's fleet alive. He told Pete that. He told him he understood the risk. He had run a fleet of 4 aging machines for 6 years and watched every one of them fail him at exactly the wrong moment. And he was done betting on quantity when what he actually needed was one machine that didn't quit. He signed the financing papers on a Thursday afternoon, and 3 days later a Massey Ferguson 8S Series tractor rolled off the trailer and into a yard that had, for the first time in living memory, nothing else parked beside it. That spring, word moved through the county the way it always does, faster than any planting could happen. The Voss boy sold the whole fleet for one tractor. People said it at the co-op, at church, at the implement dealership 2 towns over where farmers gathered on Saturday mornings to drink bad coffee and trade opinions about everyone else's decisions. Some called it bold. Most called it reckless. A few, including Russ Tedder, said it outright to Daniel's face that he had 3 months to prove it wasn't the dumbest thing a Voss had ever done. Planting season arrived, and for the first few weeks, the tractor did exactly what the spec sheet promised. Daniel covered ground alone that used to take him and a hired hand working 2 machines in tandem. The fuel bills came in lower than he had budgeted. The precision guidance system cut his overlap and seed waste to almost nothing. And for the first time in years, he finished a planting pass with daylight left in the afternoon, instead of running headlights until 10 at night. Russ noticed. He didn't say anything, but Daniel caught him slowing his truck on the section road more than once that April, watching the Massey Ferguson work a field in half the time his own crew needed with 2 tractors. It was the first quiet crack in the rivalry, the first sign that maybe the bet wasn't as foolish as the auction crowd had assumed. Cole rode along most evenings that spring, learning the guidance system, watching his father finish fields before dark for the first time either of them could remember. For a few weeks, it looked like the gamble had simply paid off, clean and uncomplicated, the kind of story that would have made a fine ending if the season had stopped there. It didn't. But a documentary about a single perfect season isn't a story. It's a brochure. And the summer of that year was not interested in being kind to anyone who had bet everything on a single roll of the dice. The first sign of trouble came in late June, 3 weeks before wheat harvest, when wheat futures dropped hard on a single trading day, driven by a larger global harvest forecast that nobody in central Kansas could control or predict. Daniel had locked in part of his crop early, the conservative move his father always preached, but he had left a meaningful percentage unhedged, gambling that prices would hold or climb closer to harvest the way they sometimes did. They didn't. The number on the elevator board dropped nearly $1 a bushel inside 2 weeks, and Daniel watched the margin he had built his entire financing plan around shrink in front of him almost daily. Then, 11 days before he planned to start cutting wheat, the tractor's hydraulic system threw a fault code Daniel had never seen before, the kind of warning that stops a man cold because he knows exactly how little room there is in his schedule to lose even one day, let alone a week. Halverson called him 2 days after the price drop hit the elevator board, not to threaten anything, but to ask, in the careful tone bankers use when they're already worried about a number on a spreadsheet, whether Daniel's unhedged bushels were going to be a problem for the fall payment schedule. Daniel told him it would work itself out. He didn't fully believe it himself when he said it. He called Pete Aldrich at the dealership in a tone that didn't bother hiding the panic underneath it. Pete didn't sugarcoat the diagnosis. A hydraulic pump issue, not catastrophic, but not something fixed in an afternoon either. Parts would need to come from a regional distribution center. Best case, 3 days. Worst case, closer to a week, depending on availability and how many other operators in the region needed the same part during the exact same window. Every farmer in 3 states was racing the same harvest calendar. This was the moment Pete had warned him about in the dealerships 6 months earlier. One machine, one point of failure. No backup sitting in the shed to lean on while the Massey Ferguson sat dead in the yard with the hood open and a service technician shaking his head over the engine bay. Word got out within 2 days, the way it always does in a farming community, small enough that everyone's combined schedule is common knowledge. Russ Tedder drove past the Voss place twice that week, slow, and the second time he stopped his truck at the end of the driveway long enough for Daniel to see him shaking his head before he pulled away without a word. Daniel didn't need to hear what Russ was thinking. He'd thought the same thing himself, standing in his own yard at 6 in the morning staring at a tractor that wouldn't start, with a wheat crop standing in the field getting closer to shatter loss with every additional day of delay and every gust of wind that threatened a summer storm. His wife asked him that week, gently but directly, whether he regretted it. Whether if he could go back to the auction yard in February, he would make the same call again. Daniel didn't have a clean answer. He told her the truth, which was that he didn't know yet, and that he wouldn't know until the wheat was either in the bin or lost in the field. In the meantime, he and Cole spent 2 of those 5 idle days under the tractor, with a service manual spread across the toolbox, trying to confirm what Pete had already diagnosed over the phone, mostly because standing in the yard doing nothing was worse than doing anything at all. They didn't fix it. They weren't going to fix it. But Cole watched his father work through the problem methodically instead of panicking out loud, and years later, that was the part of the season Cole would describe first when people asked him about it. The part arrived on day 5, a full 2 days faster than Pete's worst-case estimate, partly because Pete had personally called in a favor with a regional parts manager who understood exactly what was riding on it for a customer he respected. The technician had the pump installed and the tractor running again by early afternoon, and Daniel was back in the field by sundown, running lights deep into the night to claw back the days he had lost. What followed was 8 days of harvest that Daniel would later describe, when he was willing to talk about it at all, as the hardest stretch of farming he had ever done. The single tractor that had carried his entire planting season alone now had to carry his entire harvest schedule alone too, and he ran it from before sunrise until well past dark, trading sleep for acres, racing a forecast that had a significant rain system, building 2 states to the west and moving steadily closer. Russ Tedder's crew, running 2 combines and a grain cart operation with 3 hired hands, finished their harvest 4 days ahead of Daniel and had the luxury of watching the weather reports from the comfort of being done. Daniel did not have that luxury. He had 1 tractor pulling grain carts between combine and bin lines, and every hour of daylight mattered in a way it hadn't mattered to him in years. On the second-to-last evening, Russ drove past again, the way he had during the breakdown, except this time he stopped, rolled down his window, and asked Daniel if he needed an extra hand for the final push. It wasn't an apology. Men like Russ didn't deliver those directly. But it was as close as Daniel had heard him come, and Daniel told him he'd manage, mostly out of the same stubbornness that had started the whole bet in February. On the final day, with roughly 60 acres standing and a storm front visible on the horizon by mid-afternoon, Daniel made the call to push through without stopping, running the Massey Ferguson at a pace that had it working harder and longer in a single stretch than at any point since he'd bought it. The fuel efficiency that had impressed him all spring became something closer to essential that final afternoon, stretching every tank further than the diesel-hungry equipment he'd sold off the previous winter ever could have managed under the same pressure. He finished the last pass at 9:40 that night, headlights cutting through the first scattered drops of rain, with the storm arriving in full force less than 2 hours later. 60 acres that, on his old fleet, with its history of breakdowns and its need for 2 operators he no longer had, might easily have been lost to hail or flattened stalks. Instead, they were in the bin. When the final numbers came in that fall, after the elevator settled accounts and the bank reviewed the season's books, the story wasn't the fantasy ending the auction crowd had probably expected one way or the other. Daniel hadn't gotten rich. The $1 a bushel price drop in June had cost him real money he never fully recovered that year, and the financing payment on the Massey Ferguson sat heavier on his monthly budget than the old patched-together fleet ever had. But the farm was still his. The harvest was in, and for the first time in 3 years, Halverson at the bank reviewed a balance sheet from the Voss operation that didn't make him reach for the folder marked declined. Halverson sat across the same desk where he'd delivered the no 14 months earlier, and told Daniel, without much warmth but without the old caution either, that he'd approve an operating line for the following spring. He didn't say he'd been wrong to deny the first loan. Bankers rarely do. He just slid a new folder across the desk, opened this time, and let Daniel read the numbers for himself. Russ Tedder never apologized, not directly, because that wasn't how men like Russ operated. But the following February, when Daniel pulled into the same consignment auction yard, this time not to sell but to watch, Russ found him in the crowd and said flatly, without much ceremony, that he'd been wrong about the basket and the eggs. He still thought it was a hell of a risk. He just no longer thought it had been a stupid one. Daniel didn't pretend the season had been easy, and he never told anyone it had been worth the 11 sleepless nights or the week he spent staring at a dead hydraulic pump while his crop sat exposed to weather he couldn't control. What he told people instead, when they asked, was simpler than that. He said the bank had told him no, and the auction crowd had told him he was finished, and the only thing that had told him otherwise was a single Massey Ferguson tractor that had to be right every single day because there was nothing standing behind it if it wasn't. It was right enough, often enough, for the Voss farm to still be standing the following spring. Not triumphant, not vindicated in some grand, undeniable way that silenced every doubter in the county for good. Just standing, the way a farm survives a hard year, 1 tank of diesel and 1 finished field at a time, with a debt that was smaller than it would have been, and a respect from the neighbors that had been earned the only way it ever really gets earned out here, which is by being the last one still working when the storm finally arrives. Cole was the one who put it simplest. Months later, when a cousin visiting from out of state asked him whether his dad regretted selling everything for one tractor. Cole thought about it for a second and said his father didn't talk about regret much, only about whether a thing did its job when it had to. By that measure, there wasn't much left to argue about. The Massey Ferguson had been asked to do the work of 4 machines in the worst year the family had faced since his grandfather died, and it had done it, not perfectly, not without cost, but completely, which on a farm is usually the only kind of victory that counts.